At the beginning of America's entry into the Second World War, many German generals scoffed at the idea that American artillery could pose a serious threat. In their minds, artillery was the refined tool of the European masters. Germany with its precision-engineered 88s, France with its long tradition of gunnery, and the Soviets with their overwhelming barrages. The Americans, by contrast, were seen as industrial brutes, more comfortable with factories than fire control, with trucks than tactics. The German high command, steeped in arrogance from their swift victories across Poland and France, dismissed the American field pieces as clumsy, untested, and inferior. What could a young and inexperienced army possibly know about the art of gunnery? What they failed to grasp was that America's approach to war was different. Where others prized complexity, the United States prized standardization. Where others built limited runs of specialized weapons, America embraced mass production. The 105mm howitzer M2A1 at the time was not designed to impress with exotic engineering or terrifying caliber. It was designed to be reliable, adaptable, and above all, abundant. It could be produced in staggering numbers, hauled anywhere by truck or half-track, and operated by crews trained in weeks rather than years. It was, in many ways, the perfect expression of America's war philosophy: simple enough to be universal, powerful enough to be decisive. In the early days, German confidence remained unshaken. When reports first trickled in of American divisions landing in North Africa, commanders dismissed the artillery component as little more than noise. The vaunted Wehrmacht had faced the French 75s, the British 25-pounders, and the massive Soviet guns. They had survived barrages that shook the earth itself. Surely the American Runner 5 would be little more than an annoyance. But when the campaigns began in earnest, reality struck with thunderous force. The Americans understood that artillery was not merely a supporting arm, it was the backbone of their doctrine. Where German strategy prized maneuver and shock, the US Army put its faith in firepower. Every division was built around the certainty that when called upon, the guns would answer, and the guns always answered. Batteries of Runner 5s positioned with care and supplied with endless ammunition could lay down walls of steel at a moment's notice. Infantry advancing under their cover felt invincible. Enemies caught in their blast felt annihilated. German officers at the front soon realized that they were facing something different than they had expected. Instead of the occasional carefully rationed bombardment they associated with the British or even their own doctrine, the Americans unleashed barrages with shocking frequency. A single regiment could summon dozens of tubes to fire in unison, saturating an area with shells until nothing living remained. What the Germans had dismissed as amateurish turned out to be overwhelming. The Tenno-Hives were not precision scalpels. They were hammers, and they fell with unrelenting regularity. The first encounters left German troops shaken. Survivors described the uncanny coordination of American fire missions. Spotters relayed targets with speed, communications worked flawlessly, and within minutes entire landscapes were transformed into fields of smoke and craters. German platoons trained to dig in and weather artillery found themselves buried beneath storms of steel that lasted far longer than expected. The barrages seemed endless, as though the Americans had limitless shells to throw. In truth, they nearly did. American logistics, unmatched in scale, ensured that the guns never went silent for long. In North Africa, where Rommel's Afrika Korps had once dashed confidently across open deserts, the rhythm changed. The Desert Fox himself remarked on the weight of American fire, noting with frustration how often his attacks stalled under the relentless pounding of one. His generals, who had once laughed at the thought of American gunnery, now watched their columns shredded before they could close with the enemy. Tanks bogged down not because of anti-tank fire, but because supply lines, staging areas, and assembly points were obliterated before the attack could even begin. The power of the Runner Hive was not just in its blast, but in its adaptability. It could fire high explosive shells to smash infantry, smoke rounds to obscure movements, or even specialized charges to break fortifications. Crews became experts at shifting targets with speed, adjusting fire with uncanny precision. American artillery doctrine emphasized responsiveness. If an infantry platoon radioed for support, the guns spoke within minutes. For German soldiers used to slower, more deliberate fire support, the contrast was shocking. They could not move, could not regroup, without drawing down the wrath of the ever-present American batteries. As reports reached higher German headquarters, the laughter that had once greeted the field officers began to complain that their men could not advance, that morale was collapsing under the constant barrages. Units were arriving at the line already shaken, their cohesion shattered before they even faced American infantry. The generals who had once dismissed American artillery as crude were forced to admit that it was something far more dangerous, an industrial engine of destruction that erased the battlefield with terrifying efficiency. And in this, the German high command began to see a larger truth. They were not merely fighting American soldiers, they were fighting American factories, American trucks, American railroads. Every shell that whistled overhead was the product of an industrial empire that dwarfed their own. The 105 was not just a gun, it was the voice of an entire nation mobilized for war. By the time the campaign in North Africa reached its climax, the arrogance had vanished. The Germans no longer mocked the 105mm howitzer. They feared, for they had learned through fire and blood, that when the Americans called on their artillery, the battlefield itself changed. It was not just support, it was dominance. And the guns would keep speaking, from North Africa to Italy, to Normandy and beyond, until the Reich itself lay in ruin. As the campaign in North Africa dragged on, the German perception of American artillery underwent a dramatic transformation. At first, they had dismissed the 105mm as a blunt tool of an inexperienced army. By 1943, they were calling it one of the most formidable obstacles to their survival. Reports from the Africa Corps painted a grim picture. Battalions pinned down for hours under rolling barrages, supply columns shredded before they reached the front, and counterattacks broken apart before they had even begun. The Americans had mastered the art of synchronization, coordinating infantry advances with the thunder of artillery, so that every step forward was shielded by fire. Rommel himself was stunned by the tempo. In Europe, artillery was used with care. Ammunition stocks were limited, guns were preserved for decisive moments, and commanders thought carefully about when to unleash their batteries. But the Americans seemed to have no such limitations. They fired with abandon, saturating entire sectors with shells, then doing it again an hour later. German officers quickly realized this was no wastefulness. It was strategy. The Americans had built their war machine to make firepower the constant companion of their troops. Artillery was not an occasional hammer, it was the steady drumbeat of their advance. For the average German soldier, this drumbeat was terrifying. Platoons dug into trenches found themselves buried by waves of shells that plowed up the earth, shattered timber, and tore men apart. The 105mm howitzers' high explosive rounds had a devastating effect, producing both physical destruction and psychological collapse. Survivors described the helplessness of crouching in a foxhole, unable to move or fight back as the sky screamed and the ground shook. Even hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, who had endured Soviet barrages, admitted that the Americans' consistency was uniquely demoralizing. It wasn't just the scale, it was the relentlessness. American artillery officers developed a doctrine that amplified this fear. Instead of firing in short, furious bursts, they used techniques like the time-on-target barrage, in which shells from multiple batteries were calculated to land simultaneously. To German troops on the receiving end, this meant sudden, shocking waves of explosions that seemed to erupt from nowhere. Before men could adjust, before commanders could rally, the next wave came. The battlefield became unpredictable, ruled not by German initiative, but by the timing of American guns. The versatility of the 105 also became a nightmare for German formations. Smoke rounds blinded observation posts, preventing counterattacks from being coordinated. Airburst shells, timed to explode above ground, tore through men hiding in trenches or behind cover. Harassing fire landed on crossroads, forcing convoys to scatter and stall. Everywhere the Germans moved, they were under threat. It was as though the Americans had extended invisible hands across the battlefield, reaching into places once thought safe. One of the greatest shocks to German commanders was the speed of American fire mission. In their doctrine, artillery was controlled at higher levels, with fire support taking time to organize. The Americans pushed authority down to the regimental and even battalion level. A company pinned down could call in fire, and within minutes, shells would be landed. This responsiveness meant German counterattacks, once their pride, often collapsed before they gained momentum. The moment American infantry reported movement, the 105s opened up, tearing gaps in the attackers before they reached rifle range. The logistical machine behind these guns was equally demoralizing. German soldiers marveled and despaired at the sheer abundance of shells. Captured American supply dumps revealed mountains of ammunition, far beyond what the Wehrmacht could ever hope to stockpile. Trucks streamed forward with endless resupply, ensuring the guns never fell silent. To fight against such an opponent felt like drowning in fire. Every attempt to catch a breath was answered with another barrage. By the time the Americans moved into Sicily and Italy, the reputation of the 105 was firmly established. German generals no longer mocked it in their briefings. Instead, they warned their men of its devastating efficiency. They noted how often their lines were softened up by hour-long barrages before infantry moved in. They noted how tanks were isolated, not by direct hits, but by barrages that severed communication lines and supply routes. They noted the way entire units were paralyzed, unable to maneuver for fear of being caught under a storm of steel. The battles in Italy drove the lesson home. In the mountainous terrain, artillery became even more decisive. German defenses built into ridges and hillsides, thought impregnable, were torn open by concentrated fire. The 105's shells smashed bunkers, collapsed dugouts, and forced defenders into the open, where infantry and armor finished the job. Time and again, the Germans discovered that no position was truly safe. The Americans had perfected the art of using their guns to erase natural advantages. What cut deepest was the realization that their contempt had blinded them. They had laughed at the American artillery, and now they were being bled dry by it. Their generals had once boasted that the Wehrmacht's discipline and skill would overwhelm the inexperienced enemy. Yet those same generals now ordered retreats, their men shattered not by bayonets or tanks, but by the rain of shells from the very guns they had mocked. The 105mm howitzer was no longer a curiosity or an afterthought. It had become the bane of German defenses, a weapon that shattered morale as effectively as it shattered walls. And as the war ground on, from North Africa to Italy to France, its thunder only grew louder. The laughter was gone, replaced by a grim respect and a growing fear of what would come next. By the time American forces pushed into Italy in late 1943, the German generals had abandoned their mockery. Instead, they approached every battle with one wary question: how long until the American guns opened up? The answer, more often than not, was sooner than expected. The 105mm howitzer had become the heartbeat of the U.S. Army, its presence so constant that American infantry joked they never went anywhere without their guardian angels. For German troops, those angels were demons, unleashing storms of steel that shattered the ground beneath them. The Italian campaign was tailor-made for artillery. The mountainous terrain, crisscrossed with valleys and ridges, made movement slow and cover unreliable. German commanders relied heavily on defensive strongpoints, believing their well-dug positions could withstand attack. But the Americans countered with methodical barrages that turned stone and concrete into dust. A hillside bunker could resist rifles and even tanks, but it could not withstand hours of sustained pounding from dozens of... When the shelling ended, the defenders emerged stunned and disoriented, only to be swept aside by advancing infantry. What impressed and horrified the Germans was not just the power of the 105, but the precision with which it was used. American forward observers, equipped with radios and trained to direct fire quickly, turned every platoon into the eyes of the artillery. If a machine gun nest slowed an advance, within minutes shells would rain down on it. If German troops attempted to regroup behind cover, smoke rounds blinded them, followed by explosives that tore them apart. This ability to call down fire on demand changed the rhythm of battle. No German position, however small, could count on being safe once spotted. The psychological impact deepened with each engagement. Survivors spoke of the crushing sense of helplessness, of waiting for barrages that seemed to last forever. They described the ground buckling, the air filled with smoke and dust, the deafening roar that drowned out thought. Men emerged from the bombardments shaken, often too dazed to resist the infantry that followed. Others never emerged at all, buried in collapsed trenches or blown apart by direct hits. For many, the terror of artillery fire eclipsed even the fear of tanks or airstrike. Tanks could be destroyed, planes could be evaded, but the guns always found you. German officers quickly realized that their own artillery could not match this tempo. They had excellent guns, but not the same abundance of shells, nor the same doctrine of constant support. German batteries were often forced to conserve ammunition, saving their fire for critical moments. The Americans, by contrast, seemed to fire without pause. Every attack was heralded by barrages, every defense supported by counter-barrages, every retreat shielded by fire. The disparity in supply chains was glaring, and it gave the Americans a decisive edge. In battles like Monte Cassino, the pattern repeated with brutal clarity. German paratroopers, among the most elite in the Wehrmacht, held the heights with ferocious determination. Yet even they struggled under the endless barrages of 105mm shells. Hillsides were scarred beyond recognition, buildings reduced to rubble, and defensive lines broken again and again by concentrated fire. Though the battle dragged on, German reports made one fact clear: the American artillery was grinding down even their best. The Germans tried to adapt. They dispersed their positions, dug deeper, and shifted their movements to avoid observation. They launched counter-battery fire, trying to silence the American guns with their own, but the Americans were prepared. Camouflage, mobility, and sheer numbers kept their batteries firing. Even when a few guns were destroyed, replacements rolled into place within hours. It was a fight Germany could not win. They were being outproduced, outsupplied, and outgunned. For the American infantry, this support was transformative. Soldiers who might have hesitated under machine gun fire pressed forward with confidence, knowing the artillery was only a radio call away. They trusted the guns to break obstacles, to punish counterattacks, to shield their advances. This trust gave them momentum, and momentum in war is priceless. The Germans, meanwhile, learned that momentum was impossible to build when every attempt at movement risked being swallowed in explosion. By 1944, the German generals no longer laughed at the 105mm. Instead, they warned their men to expect its thunder at every turn. Reports circulated that American artillery had become the single most feared element of their arsenal. Tanks could be fought, planes could be dodged, but the artillery was inescapable. It followed them into every valley, every ridge, every fortified town. It was the constant reminder that they were fighting not just soldiers, but a nation's industrial might. The 105mm Howitzer had transformed from an underestimated tool into a decisive weapon of war. It was not glamorous like a fighter plane or terrifying like a tank, but it was relentless, and in its relentlessness lay its power. The Germans had laughed once. Now they ducked their heads and prayed when they heard the familiar whistle of shells overhead. The barrage had become the true master of the battlefield. By the spring of 1944, the 105mm Howitzer was no longer just a weapon on the battlefield. It was a reputation. German troops spoke of it with a mixture of fear and frustration, knowing that wherever American forces appeared, the thunder of artillery was never far behind. In Italy, entire divisions found themselves pinned down not by tanks or planes, but by the sheer weight of shell fire. The Americans had learned to weave artillery into every action, turning it into the invisible hand that shaped every battle. The doctrine was simple yet devastatingly effective: never let the infantry fight alone. German commanders, schooled in the Blitzkrieg tradition, relied on speed, maneuver, and concentrated shock to overwhelm their opponents, but the Americans had created a system that absorbed those blows with artillery. Every time German troops attempted to surge forward, they found themselves caught in a storm of shells. Every time they tried to hold ground, their positions were pulverized before the assault even began. The 105s turned German strengths into weaknesses, blunting their offensives and unraveling their defenses. What astonished German officers most was the responsiveness. A patrol pinned down in a vineyard could radio for support, and within minutes, 105mm shells were crashing down on the enemy position. This speed of fire missions was unheard of in the Wehrmacht, where artillery coordination often took hours. American gunners drilled constantly to ensure that once the call came, the response was immediate. To German soldiers on the ground, this made the artillery feel omnipresent, as though every rifle squad had the power of a battery behind it. In places like Anzio, this responsiveness made the difference between survival and disaster. The Germans launched furious counterattacks to push the Allies back into the sea. They came with armor, infantry, and the confidence that had carried them across Europe. But each attack was shattered by walls of artillery fire. Shells rained down in such density that entire assaults dissolved before they reached American lines. Survivors described the horror of advancing into fields where the earth itself erupted beneath their feet, where trees splintered into fragments,
and where entire companies disappeared in the dust. The Germans realized that their tactical brilliance could not survive against such overwhelming firepower. American officers refined these techniques even further, creating rolling barrages that advanced like a curtain of fire ahead of their troops. German defenders trapped in trenches or bunkers were forced to endure the bombardment only to emerge disoriented and broken when the infantry arrived. Even elite units, paratroopers and panzer grenadiers were powerless under this kind of fire. Training and discipline meant little when the very ground collapsed around them. The psychological toll was immense. German soldiers dreaded the opening of each battle, knowing the barrage would come. They described the sound as unbearable, the sky filled with a constant shriek, the ground shuddering with every impact. Men who had fought bravely against tanks and aircraft admitted they felt powerless against artillery. You could shoot down a plane, you could destroy a tank, but you could not fight the shells. All you could do was endure, and endurance had its limits. The 105mm Barrage also disrupted the German chain of command. Officers found it nearly impossible to coordinate under constant shelling. Runners were killed, radios destroyed and orders delayed until they no longer mattered. Units isolated by bombardments became fragmented, fighting blindly without leadership. To the Americans, this chaos was intentional. Their doctrine aimed not only to kill but to paralyze. A commander who could not communicate was as useless as one who had been killed.
Perhaps the greatest irony for the Germans was that they had once believed themselves the masters of artillery science. They had prided themselves on the precision of the 88, on the quality of their guns, on their training and fire control. Yet the Americans, with their supposedly crude and inexperienced methods, had outmatched them by sheer scale and efficiency. The 105 was not the most advanced weapon, but it was the right weapon, produced in vast numbers, supported by flawless logistics, and wielded with relentless determination. As Allied forces prepared for the invasion of France, German commanders braced themselves for what they knew was coming. The Americans would bring their artillery across the Channel, and with it, the same devastating fire that had broken their lines in Italy. Some officers clung to hope that the terrain of Normandy might give them an advantage, but many, recalling the barrages in Sicily, Anzio and Cassino, knew the truth. Wherever the Americans went, the 105s would follow, and with them came destruction. By mid-1944, the laughter of German generals had long since faded. In its place was respect born of fear. They no longer dismissed American artillery as amateurish. They recognized it as one of the decisive instruments of the war, a weapon that had reshaped battlefields and humbled their army. The 105mm howitzer had silenced the arrogance of the Reich with a voice of thunder, and that voice was only growing louder as the Allies turned their gaze toward France. In the summer of 1944, the storm that German generals had feared finally arrived. The Allies landed in Normandy, and with them came the familiar thunder of the American 105mm howitzers. For the German defenders entrenched in hedgerows, villages and fortified positions, the invasion was not just a clash of men, but a deluge of firepower. The Americans had perfected the art of bringing their guns ashore quickly, establishing batteries within hours of landing. Once the beachheads were secure, the 105s began to speak, and the landscape of northern France echoed with their voice. The bocage country of Normandy, with its hedgerows and small fields, seemed like terrain that would favor the defenders. German generals hoped the thick walls of earth and brush would blunt the Allied advance, but the Americans adapted, using their artillery to tear holes in these natural fortifications. A single barrage could flatten hedgerows, destroy hidden machine gun nests, and open lanes for infantry and armor. German soldiers who once felt safe behind these defenses found them crumbling under the relentless impact of high explosive shells. Forward observers became the critical link in this campaign. Equipped with radios, they directed artillery fire with precision, calling in strikes on enemy strongpoints that had stalled the advance. A machine gun nest that pinned down a platoon could be silenced within minutes by a hail of mortar crews, anti-tank positions, even individual snipers, all found themselves hunted by an unseen hand, guiding the guns. To German defenders, it felt as though the Americans had eyes everywhere, and behind those eyes the thunder always followed. The Germans tried to counter with their own artillery. Their 88s were legendary, their larger guns formidable, But the disparity lay in volume and coordination. German batteries were effective when they fired, but they lacked the ammunition stocks to sustain constant barrage. Their guns often went silent for hours, rationing shells. The Americans, by contrast, seemed never to run dry. Their barrages rolled on with terrifying consistency, sometimes lasting for hours, sometimes repeated multiple times a day. The imbalance was clear to every man in the field. What broke German morale most was the unpredictability of American fire. Units would be ordered to prepare for a counterattack, only to be shredded before they even left their assembly areas. Convoys moving along roads were annihilated by sudden strike. Reinforcements attempting to bolster a collapsing line were scattered by precisely timed shelling. To fight under these conditions was to fight blind. Commanders never knew when their plans would disintegrate under the next barrage. The battlefield belonged not to maneuver, but to the gun. By this stage, the Americans had refined their doctrine to near perfection. Artillery was not an afterthought, but the centerpiece of battle. Infantry advanced behind creeping barrages, armor moved under the umbrella of fire, and counterattacks were answered with walls of shell. The 105mm howitzer was everywhere, its range sufficient to cover most of the battlefield, its mobility ensuring it could be repositioned quickly. The Germans could never escape it. Even when they withdrew, harassing fire followed them, striking crossroads and choke points to ensure their retreat turned into chaos. The psychological effect grew unbearable. Soldiers wrote in diaries of their fear, describing the endless shelling as worse than anything they had endured on the Eastern Front. Some confessed that they longed for a tank battle or a firefight, anything that allowed them to fight back. But against the artillery, they felt powerless. A man could steel himself against an enemy he could see. Against shells falling from an unseen distance, there was no defense but luck, and luck always ran out. German generals who had once mocked American artillery now planned their operations with its destructive power in mind. They avoided massing troops, knowing such concentrations would only draw fire. They dug deeper, built stronger bunkers, and dispersed their units. Yet even these precautions offered little relief. The Americans adapted in turn, using airbursts to strike trenches, smoke to blind defenders, and coordinated fire missions to saturate wide areas. There was no escape from the reach of. By the time the Allies broke out of Normandy, the Germans were reeling not only from the loss of ground, but from the collapse of morale. They could no longer pretend that American artillery was inferior. It had proven itself superior in every way that mattered: speed, volume, and integration. The 105mm howitzer had become the backbone of an unstoppable advance, flattening defenses and breaking the will of those who tried to resist. The laughter of 1942, when German generals had dismissed American guns as unworthy of respect, now seemed like madness. The reality of 1944 was written in fire and steel across the fields of France, and as the Americans pushed eastward, their artillery followed, ready to unleash the same thunder on every German line that dared to stand in their way. The German generals had once prided themselves on their mastery of combined arms warfare. Blitzkrieg had conquered half of Europe with the coordination of tanks, infantry, and aircraft. But in France after D-Day, their cherished doctrine was broken again and again by a weapon they had underestimated: the American 105mm howitzer. The very element they had laughed at became the cornerstone of Allied strength, dissolving German counterattacks before they gained momentum. In the hedgerow battles of Normandy, artillery played an especially decisive role. German defenders believed the bocage terrain, with its dense walls of earth and brush, would negate American firepower. Instead, the Americans turned the hedgerows into death traps. When a German unit revealed its position with gunfire, forward observers immediately marked it. Within minutes, entire fields were engulfed in explosion. Machine gun nests vanished, mortar teams were shredded, and armored vehicles were immobilized by near misses that buckled tracks and crushed wheels. The hedgerows that had promised safety became cages, trapping soldiers under barrages that they could not escape. American artillery officers became adept at coordinating rolling barrages that moved in sync with infantry advances. German troops pinned in their trenches would endure minutes of hell, then rise to face advancing riflemen still supported by fire from. Even when defenders resisted fiercely, they were soon broken by the combination of infantry fire and the promise of another barrage moments later. The rhythm of battle was dictated not by German initiative, but by the American timetable of shelling. For German tank commanders, the experience was equally grim. They had once trusted their panzers to punch through Allied lines, but American artillery targeted them with ruthless efficiency. Tanks massing for an attack found themselves under concentrated fire, shells raining down to disable vehicles before they ever reached the front. Crews abandoned their machines in panic, leaving them as burning hulks in the field. Even when tanks broke through, harassing fire on supply lines and assembly points ensured they were soon isolated and forced to retreat. The responsiveness of the American guns shocked even seasoned veterans. German officers, accustomed to calling in artillery with long delays, could not comprehend how quickly the Americans fired back. A firefight might begin in a village, and within minutes, shells were crashing into German positions with devastating accuracy. Survivors recalled the terror of realizing that every shot they fired seemed to invite a thunderous response. There was no time to regroup, no chance to maneuver. Once spotted, destruction was inevitable. Morale across the German ranks eroded steadily. Soldiers dug deeper trenches, reinforced bunkers, and spread out their positions, but none of it was enough. The 105mm howitzers' versatility made it the answer to every defense. Smoke rounds blinded defenders, making counterfire impossible. Airbursts shredded troops who thought they were safe below ground. High explosives reduced buildings to rubble, burying anyone inside. Each adaptation by the Germans was met with a counter-adaptation by the Americans. It was a battle not only of men but of doctrines, and the American doctrine was winning. The logistical disparity made this dominance even more crushing. German units rationed shells carefully, often firing only a handful before falling silent to conserve stock. American batteries, fed by an endless chain of trucks, fired hundreds without hesitation. It was not uncommon for an American battalion to expend more shells in a day than a German division could manage in a week. This abundance created a constant sense of imbalance. German troops joked bitterly that the Americans measured ammunition not in rounds but in tons. Behind the grim humor lay despair. For civilians caught in the middle, the barrages were apocalyptic. Villages along the front lines were reduced to ruins, their churches and homes blasted apart by dueling artillery. German propaganda tried to frame the destruction as evidence of American barbarism, but the soldiers living under the shelling knew the truth. It was not cruelty, it was efficiency. The Americans were dismantling the battlefield with cold precision, turning every stronghold into rubble before their troops advanced. By late summer, as the Allies broke out of Normandy, German generals could no longer deny reality. Their armies were bleeding men and machines at a rate they could not replace. Counterattacks that had once been the pride of the Wehrmacht collapsed under curtains of fire. Supply lines that had once been arteries of conquest were severed daily by shells landing on crossroads and bridges. The 105mm howitzer had become the metronome of destruction, its rhythm pounding out the inevitable defeat of German arms in France. What stung most of all was the memory of their arrogance. They had laughed at the very idea that American artillery could challenge their seasoned troops. Yet now every report they filed, every retreat they ordered, carried the same bitter acknowledgement. The 105mm barrage was unstoppable. It had become the symbol of American war-making power. Reliable, adaptable, and relentless. The laughter of 1942 had been buried under the thunder of 1944, and the echoes of that thunder grew louder with every mile the Allies advanced toward Germany. As the Allies surged eastward in the late summer of 1944, the American Disarray de 40 American 105mm howitzer was no longer just a weapon of war. It was a constant presence, as dependable as the sunrise. German generals who had once dismissed it as insignificant now dreaded its influence on every battlefield. Reports from the front carried the same refrain: the Americans did not advance without their artillery, and wherever their artillery went, German defenses crumbled. The battles across northern France highlighted this truth with brutal clarity. In towns like Saint-Lô, German defenders clung to fortified ruins, believing the rubble itself would give them an advantage, but American artillery erased those illusions. Hour after hour, 105mm shells crashed into the city, reducing even sturdy stone walls to dust. The defenders who survived the bombardments emerged dazed and battered,
only to face fresh American infantry. The battle was less a contest of men than a contest of endurance, and the German defenders found themselves exhausted long before the Americans slowed. The American practice of massed fires shocked the Germans most of all. In European tradition, artillery was used with care, concentrated for decisive blows. The Americans, however, treated firepower as a constant, a tool to shape the battlefield from the first shot to the last. When one battery fired, others joined in, until the sky itself seemed to scream. German officers described entire landscapes vanishing under storms of steel. Trenches were obliterated, forests shredded, villages leveled. The sheer volume of fire created a new kind of warfare, one in which maneuver was impossible until the guns had spoken. Even German armored units, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, found themselves helpless under the barrage. Panzers massing for counterattacks were torn apart before they reached striking distance. Those that survived the bombardment often advanced into churned fields that made movement slow and exposed. Artillery fire isolated tanks from their infantry, leaving them vulnerable to American bazookas, mines, and anti-tank guns. What was once Germany's greatest weapon had become a liability under the relentless attention of the Fies. The psychological damage grew with each barrage. Survivors spoke of men breaking down under the noise, clutching their helmets as shells rained around them. Even seasoned veterans admitted that the constant pounding was unbearable. Some compared it to the worst barrages of the First World War, but with a difference. In 1916, barrages eventually stopped. In 1944, American barrages seemed endless. The supply lines feeding the guns never faltered, and the guns themselves never cooled. To the Germans, it felt like fighting an enemy with infinite resources, an impression not far from the truth. For American troops, the presence of artillery was a source of comfort and confidence. Infantrymen advanced with the assurance that if they ran into resistance, the guns would speak on their behalf. Tank crews trusted the barrages to soften enemy defenses before they entered the fight. Commanders built every plan around the certainty that their artillery would deliver. This trust created momentum, and momentum carried the Allies forward faster than the Germans could regroup. The German generals who had once laughed at American artillery now scrambled to find ways to counter it. They tried dispersing their forces, digging deeper, and hiding in forests. But the Americans adapted quickly. Airbursts were timed to explode above trenches, smoke rounds blinded hidden defenses, and creeping barrages advanced in perfect step with infantry assaults. Every solution was met with a counter-solution, and every counter-solution was drowned in fire. One captured German officer admitted with bitterness that American artillery had become the true arm of decision. "They do not fight us with men," he complained. "They fight us with shells." It was not entirely true, of course. American infantry fought and bled across every battlefield, but the perception mattered. To German soldiers, the artillery made every fight feel futile, as though the outcome was already decided before the first rifle shot was fired. The disparity in resources widened this sense of futility. German batteries, short of shells, often fired sporadically, conserving ammunition for emergencies. American batteries, fed by endless convoys of trucks and trains, fired continuously. German soldiers quickly learned to distinguish between their own barrages and those of the Americans. Their barrages were sharp, brief, and fleeting. The Americans were rolling, constant, and seemingly eternal. In that contrast lay the truth of the war itself. One side was dwindling, the other growing stronger with every passing day. By autumn 1944, as the Allies approached the German border, the reputation of the 5mm barrage was sealed. German generals no longer joked about American artillery, they spoke of it with grim respect, recognizing that it had become one of the decisive instruments of Allied victory. The barrage had silenced their mockery with thunder, and its echo rolled across every battlefield from Normandy to the Siegfried Line. The laughter of 1942, arrogant and careless, now seemed like a distant memory. In its place was the bitter realization that they had underestimated the one thing that would prove their undoing: the industrial firepower of the United States, unleashed through the barrels of the barrage had become more than a tactic, it was a verdict. And that verdict was written in fire across the ruined fields of Europe. By the time the Allies reached the German frontier in late 1944, the 5mm howitzer had already proven itself indispensable. It had carried American troops through North Africa, smashed German defenses in Italy, and thundered across the fields of France. Now, as the Allies faced the fortified lines of Germany itself, the weapon that once drew laughter from German generals became their greatest dread. The Siegfried Line was no ordinary obstacle. Stretching hundreds of miles, it bristled with bunkers, pillboxes, minefields, and dragon's teeth. German commanders believed that these fortifications would halt or at least slow the Allied advance. But the Americans brought with them the same doctrine that had carried them so far: artillery as the first and final word on the battlefield. The 105mm howitzers were deployed in vast numbers, their barrels trained on every pillbox, trench, and fortified position that stood in the way. The opening barrages were cataclysmic. Thousands of shells rained down on German positions, shaking the earth, collapsing bunkers, and cutting communication lines. Soldiers who had once boasted of the Siegfried Line's impregnability found themselves trapped inside shattered strongpoints. Survivors staggered out of the wreckage only to be driven back by more shelling. The fortifications, designed to withstand infantry and tank assaults, crumbled under the ceaseless rain of high explosive. German defenders wrote bitterly in their diaries about the futility of holding positions under such bombardments. They described endless days of shelling, nights lit by explosions, and the constant fear of the next barrage. Men huddled in dugouts, ears ringing, nerves frayed, morale eroding with every hour. They had mocked the Americans for their reliance on artillery, but now they admitted privately that it was breaking them faster than any tank assault ever could. For American troops, the guns were both shield and sword. Infantry advanced behind creeping barrages that suppressed every German machine gun nest. Engineers moved forward to dismantle obstacles, confident that artillery would silence defenders long enough to complete their work. Even tanks, vulnerable to German anti-tank weapons, relied on the fives to neutralize strongpoints before rolling forward. Every action was tied to the guns, and every success was rooted in their fire. German counterattacks fared no better, and again armored thrusts were met not just by American tanks, but by precise artillery fire that shattered their formations before they could strike. The responsiveness of the fives meant that even sudden attacks were quickly blunted. Spotters reported movements, and within minutes, shells blanketed the advancing Germans. What might have been a breakthrough dissolved into wreckage, the battlefield littered with disabled panzers and broken infantry units. The logistical machine behind the artillery was staggering. Endless convoys of trucks carried ammunition forward, ensuring that the guns never fell silent. German officers captured during the campaign expressed disbelief at the mountains of shells they saw stacked in American supply dumps. They marveled and despaired at the realization that their enemy could sustain this pace indefinitely. For every shell they fired, the Americans fired 10. For every battery they silenced, 2 more seemed to appear.
The psychological disparity was equally stark. German soldiers dreaded the sound of American guns, knowing it meant hours of torment. American troops, by contrast, found reassurance in that same sound. To them, it meant support, protection, and inevitability. The guns gave them confidence that no position was truly impregnable, that no counterattack could succeed, and that no defense could hold forever. That confidence carried them forward into Germany itself. In towns along the frontier, the devastation was absolute. Streets turned into rubble, churches collapsed under bombardment, and entire neighborhoods vanished in clouds of dust. German civilians, once assured by propaganda that the Siegfried Line would protect them, now cowered as shells tore apart the very defenses meant to keep the enemy out. The myth of safety was obliterated along with the bunkers. The barrage did not distinguish between soldier and civilian. It erased everything in its path. By late 1944, even the most hardened German generals admitted among themselves that American artillery had surpassed their expectations entirely. They had laughed once at the notion of the 100mm howitzer being decisive. Now they spoke of it with respect and frustration, acknowledging that it had become the backbone of American victory. Their armies were not being driven back by tanks alone or aircraft alone, but by the constant thunder of guns that preceded every advance. The laughter that once rang in their headquarters had long since been replaced by silence. Silence in the face of barrages that drowned out every plan. Silence in the face of supply shortages that left their own guns impotent. Silence in the face of an enemy who had mastered the art of war, not through brilliance or flair, but through relentless firepower. And in that silence, the truth echoed. The 100mm Barrage was not just a weapon, it was the hammer of inevitability. As the Allied armies pushed deeper into Germany in 1945, the sound of the 100mm howitzer became an inescapable part of the collapsing Reich. What had begun as laughter years earlier had turned into dread, and now that dread gave way to resignation. German generals, once confident in their own artillery traditions, now found themselves powerless before the endless tide of American firepower. The barrage had become not just a tactic, but a daily reality that ground their armies down. The Rhine was perhaps the clearest example of artillery's dominance. The Germans believed the great river would serve as a natural barrier, buying them time to regroup and perhaps negotiate from a position of strength. But when the Americans reached its banks, they unleashed their guns once again. Thousands of 100mm Howes rained down on the opposite shore, pulverizing defensive positions, shattering bunkers and cutting supply routes. German troops assigned to hold the line described the bombardment as unending. The sky filled with fire. The earth turned into a storm of steel. Crossing the Rhine was supposed to be impossible. The artillery made it inevitable. The German attempts at counterattacks grew increasingly desperate. With few tanks left, infantry were thrown forward in hastily organized assaults. Each time the result was the same. Spotters identified the movement, radios transmitted the coordinates, and within minutes the attackers were scattered by precise shelling. Entire battalions disintegrated under fire before they ever reached American lines. Survivors stumbled back, dazed and broken, muttering about the impossibility of advancing through such barrages. The 100mm howitzer had become a wall of fire that no amount of bravery could breach. For civilians, the impact was equally devastating. Towns along the German frontier and deep into the interior felt the fury of the guns. Streets were reduced to rubble, churches toppled, and entire neighborhoods erased. German propaganda could no longer hide the truth. The American artillery was not a myth, it was reality, and it was crushing the Reich from within. Civilians who had once mocked the Americans as clumsy now whispered fearfully of the barrages that preceded every Allied advance. The logistical machine behind the artillery remained unmatched. Endless trains and convoys fed the guns, ensuring that no matter how far the Allies advanced, their firepower never diminished. German officers, accustomed to rationing shells and carefully planning every barrage, were stunned to see the Americans firing continuously, day after day. Captured supply dumps revealed mountains of ammunition, enough to keep the guns firing indefinitely. To the Germans, this abundance felt like fighting an enemy with limitless strength. Psychologically, the contrast between the two sides was stark. German soldiers dreaded the sound of artillery, knowing it heralded destruction. American soldiers, by contrast, welcomed it. To them, the guns were a promise that they would never fight alone, that their advances would always be supported, and that the enemy would always be softened before they struck. This confidence grew with each victory, feeding momentum that the Germans could not hope to stop. Even German generals, once so dismissive, began to speak of the American artillery with grudging respect. They admitted that the 100mm had broken their counterattacks, shattered their defenses, and bled their armies dry. They recognized that it was not American tanks or even American aircraft alone that had turned the tide, but the steady, relentless thunder of the howitzers. The barrage was not glamorous, but it was decisive. By 1945, the German army was a shadow of its former self. Exhausted, undersupplied, and battered by endless shelling, it could no longer mount effective resistance. Soldiers deserted, units surrendered, and commanders abandoned positions rather than face another barrage. The laughter of 1942 had become a bitter memory, overshadowed by the reality of defeat. The 100mm howitzer, underestimated and mocked at the start, had become the hammer that broke the Wehrmacht's back. And so, as the Allies marched into the heart of Germany, the sound of artillery accompanied them. It was the soundtrack of victory, the voice of a nation's industrial power, and the final answer to the arrogance of those who had once laughed. The 100mm howage had silenced that laughter forever, replacing it with the thunder of inevitability. By the final months of the war, The 100mm howitzer was no longer just a battlefield weapon. It had become the symbol of American dominance. Its thunder rolled across every front where US troops fought, from the forests of the Ardennes to the plains of central Germany. German generals who had once ridiculed the gun as crude and unsophisticated now regarded it as one of the most decisive instruments of their defeat. The laughter that had once filled their briefings was replaced by silence and bitter resignation. The Battle of the Bulge offered the last desperate gamble of the Wehrmacht. In December 1944, German forces hurled themselves against the Allied lines in a surprise offensive, hoping to split the enemy and force a negotiated peace. At first, the attack gained ground, driving back American units caught off guard. But as soon as the artillery was organized, the tide turned. American gunners brought their 100mm Howies into action, unleashing barrages that slowed, then halted, and finally shattered the German advance. Snow-covered forests echoed with explosions, trees splintering into deadly fragments, entire battalions pinned down by fire that seemed endless. Veterans of the Ardennes remembered how the artillery saved them. Infantry dug into freezing foxholes, knew they could call on the guns to break up attacks. Tank crews relied on barrages to keep enemy infantry and anti-tank teams at bay. Even in the most desperate hours, when German armor pressed hard and ammunition ran low, the confidence in artillery never faltered. The guns spoke, and the enemy broke. Once again, the 100mm had proven itself as the backbone of American defense and the hammer of counterattack. For German soldiers, the Ardennes was a nightmare. They had hoped the snow and surprise would give them the edge, but every advance seemed to bring down more American fire. The barrages did not discriminate between seasoned veterans and fresh recruits. They fell on all with equal fury. Survivors recalled advancing into white landscapes suddenly turned black with smoke, their comrades vanishing in bursts of flame and steel. The 100mm Howies turned the forest into a death trap, erasing the advantage of surprise and momentum. The battle's failure marked the end of German hope. From that moment onward, the war was a retreat under fire. As the Allies crossed the Rhine and poured into Germany, the barrages never ceased. Bridges were smashed, crossroads cratered, strong points leveled. German commanders who tried to rally their men found themselves drowned out by the thunder of American guns. Every plan was disrupted, every counterattack crushed before it began. The artillery dictated the rhythm of battle, and that rhythm was always against the Wehrmacht. The relentless use of artillery revealed the deeper truth of America's war effort. This was an industrial conflict, and the United States had mastered it. The 100mm howitzer was not the most advanced weapon in the world, nor the largest, but it was reliable, mobile, and above all, plentiful. It was supported by a supply chain that never faltered, by factories that produced shells in the millions, and by an army trained to integrate firepower into every maneuver. The Germans had laughed at its simplicity. They had failed to understand that simplicity, when backed by scale, became power. By the spring of 1945, the German people themselves knew the sound of the hunt. Town after town fell under its barrage, streets reduced to rubble before the infantry arrived. Civilians who had once cheered their armies now cowered in basements, praying for survival as the shells rained down. The gun that had been mocked as irrelevant had become the soundtrack of their defeat. For the German generals, the lesson was bitter. Their arrogance had blinded them to the reality of modern war. They had relied on tradition, on precision, on the brilliance of maneuver. But the Americans had embraced something greater, the systematic application of firepower, delivered by weapons like the 100mm, supported by logistics no European power could match. The barrage was not just a tactic, it was the embodiment of a philosophy that overwhelmed the Wehrmacht at every turn. By the time the war ended, the laughter of 1942 was nothing but a memory drowned in the thunder of guns. The 100mm howitzer had spoken for America across every battlefield, its voice carrying from Africa to Italy, to France, to the heart of Germany. It had silenced arrogance, broken armies, and rewritten the rules of war. The generals who once laughed now stood defeated, their empire reduced to rubble beneath the relentless barrage they had mocked. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the men who had once commanded the Wehrmacht could not escape the bitter truth. Their laughter in 1942 had been premature, their arrogance misplaced. They had underestimated not only the weapon itself,
but the philosophy and industrial power behind it. The 100mm howitzer, mocked as crude and uninspired, had become the voice of an unstoppable machine. It was not the elegance of German precision engineering that won the war, but the relentlessness of American firepower, delivered in endless waves of shells that broke even the most determined defenders. For German soldiers who had endured those barrages, the memory was seared into their bones. They recalled the ground trembling for hours, the sky darkened by smoke, the whistling descent of shells that seemed to fall forever. They remembered the helplessness of waiting in foxholes, knowing survival depended not on skill or courage, but on They remembered how every counterattack was shredded before it began, how every defensive position was softened, until nothing remained. For them, the war was not defined by tank duels or dogfights in the sky. It was defined by the endless roar of American artillery. On the American side, the story was one of vindication. The infantry trusted their gunners, and the gunners trusted their howitzers. Together, they advanced from North Africa to the heart of Germany, each step accompanied by the thunder. The weapon's reliability and versatility gave them confidence. It was never glamorous, never celebrated like the bomber or the tank, but among the soldiers who depended on it, the 100mm was a lifeline. They called it the king of battle, and its crown was well earned. The generals who had once sneered at American artillery were left to confront the ruins it had created. They discovered that their precision tactics, their armored thrusts, their carefully constructed defenses, had all crumbled under the same truth. No position could withstand endless bombardment. No plan could survive when communications were cut. No army could endure when morale was shattered by constant shelling. What they had mocked as crude had revealed itself as decisive. The 105mm Barrage also carried a deeper lesson about the nature of modern war. The Germans had clung to the idea that genius and bravery could compensate for shortages. They had relied on spirit and daring, but spirit alone cannot stop steel. The Americans had shown that the true power of a modern army lay not in isolated brilliance, but in systems logistics, communication, standardization, and mass production. The howitzer was simply the most visible manifestation of that system, a barrel through which the weight of an entire nation was unleashed. For the German people, the sound of the 100mm became synonymous with defeat. Villages and towns shook as shells fell, their defenses erased before Allied troops arrived. Civilians who once believed in the propaganda of invincibility came to understand that their armies could not protect them. The barrage broke not only walls and bunkers, but faith itself. It was the relentless reminder that the Reich was doomed, that nothing could withstand the tide of American firepower. By the war's end, the reputation of the 100mm, it had humbled one of the greatest military machines in history, silenced the laughter of arrogant generals, and proven that reliability and abundance could triumph over supposed superiority. It did not win the war alone, no weapon ever does, but it was indispensable to every Allied success. From the deserts of Africa to the rivers of Germany, its thunder marked the rhythm of victory. Historians would later debate whether tanks, planes, or code breaking had been the decisive factor in defeating Nazi Germany. Yet among the veterans who fought on the ground, there was little debate. The guns had been their salvation. The barrages had broken the enemy before they themselves were broken. The 105mm howitzer had turned battlefields into landscapes of inevitability, where victory was measured not by clever maneuver, but by the simple truth that the guns never stopped firing. And so the story closed in irony. The very weapon once ridiculed had become a legend. The generals who laughed had been silenced, their armies shattered beneath the thunder they dismissed. The 105mm Barrage was not only a weapon of war, it was it declared that arrogance would not save you, that courage alone was not enough, that in the end the relentless hammer of fire would always prevail. The laughter of 1942 had echoed with pride and contempt. The silence of 1945 echoed with defeat. And between those echoes lay the story of the 105mm howitzer, the gun that turned mockery into fear, fear into respect, and respect into surrender. Its thunder rolled across continents, carrying with it the weight of inevitability. And when the last shot was fired, the world understood that the barrage had not just ended battles, it had ended an empire.